about the integrity of a Talmud Chacham, how he conducts his life vis-a-vis himself, vis-a-vis others. And he says, when he purchases something, he pays for what he buys immediately. Doesn't in any way delay payment. Whenever the payment is due immediately, he pays the payment. He's not a person who will become a guarantor on someone else's financial obligation. Or kablon means he accepts the debt. See, a guarantor means the lender first goes to the borrower, and if he can't pay, you go to the guarantor. Kablon means that the lender has a right to go even to the one who guaranteed the loan. He accepts upon himself the obligation. Harsha means to take credit. Doesn't take credit. If you can't buy it, you can't afford it, and pay for it, you don't buy it. It's the way the Talmud Chacham lives his life. Okay, let's start over again. Whenever he purchased something, he would pay immediately. The Talmud Chacham pays immediately. Doesn't leave his creditor or owes money hanging, so to say. You wait for your money. There's no such thing. You wait. I owe. I'm obligated. I address my obligation immediately. No, the Gemara tells us at the end of Yuma that Rav, who's the great Torah sage of the Talmud, he said if he would not pay the butcher on time, it would be a desecration of God's name. Why? Because if he doesn't pay on time, what's the butcher going to say? The rabbi's a thief. I need the money. How does he have a right to hold me up? He's a thief. And if the rabbi could steal, I could steal. The other way the ignorant person processes it. If the rabbi delays payment, which to me, the way he process that stealing, if the rabbi steals, I could steal. That's a Chil Hashem, that's the desecration of God's name. Because the rabbi, although it's a total baseless reason to justify stealing, but based on his non-understanding, he will interpret the behavior of the rabbi as if he's stealing. Therefore, Rav was always careful to pay, always the moment it was due. Never let it delay even a moment, the payment of that bill. That's Chil Hashem. And at Talmud Chacham, it's in the forefront of his mind that every nuance of his behavior has to be on the up and up, not to in any way infringe or cause anybody any hardship, because you never know the way that person processes it. As we're saying, he processes that's stealing. If the rabbi could steal, he's a thief. Why I can't be a thief? He doesn't become a guarantor, but doesn't accept upon himself the obligation to pay debts, and doesn't buy on credit. You buy on credit, you never know if you could pay. He does not purchase anything regarding purchasing or business unless the Torah obligates him to. Torah says, I have no choice. I must borrow for the Chag because I have an obligation to celebrate. I have no choice. Something that, yes. But if it's not obligated on Torah level, he doesn't get involved there. Why? So he should be able to keep his word. Something which I initiate, I will only initiate it if I know I can keep my word and pay on time. But to do anything which I'm not obligated to do, you never know what tomorrow will bring. Today, maybe I could afford it. Maybe tomorrow I'm not going to be able to afford at the time that I take possession. Therefore, unless it's an obligation, I have no choice. I have to do it. And with God's help, God will provide. I should be able to pay for it. But anything which is not an obligation, You never know what tomorrow will bring. And because you don't know what tomorrow will bring, therefore you don't get involved financially for that reason. He says, why? So he should be able to keep his word and he should not alter his word. People go into bankruptcy. And people originally were solvent, but you never know. And the seller relies on the integrity of the buyer. Suddenly, his business goes south. According to legal law, if the debt is owed to the business owes the debt, has to pay the debt, you go bankrupt, the creditor is out his money. But certain people, even though legally the person has no claim, but they will meet every debt. They will pay every debt, although they could abscond, so to say. No, it's the business. The business went sour. That's life. No, with this kind of person, that's no such thing. It's life. If I borrowed, I pay. But you don't have to pay. But he's out the money. If he's out the money, I'm going to compensate for what he's out because of me, myself. If let's say other people were found guilty and obligated him according to Jewish law. According to the law, he extends the period. The grace period is 2 weeks. You could have a month. The month comes, extends it further. If the person doesn't have, he's willing to, very flexible, very gentle. And he forgives them. He's not forgiving the loan. He forgives them for the inconvenience because they're not keeping their word. Not only he borrows to be gracious to others. No, bank. You buy a piece of real estate. You have they do the due diligence. The biz building, how much rent will it generate? How many apartments are occupied? What's the potential? And based on that, they know whether the loan, the property will be able to satisfy the loan plus the interest. Otherwise, they're not going to give you the money. Building hasn't been rented in 25 years. All you have is squatters in there. You understand? They're not giving you the loan. This is not sufficient collateral for what? For the amount of money. Unless there's income coming in. You have rentals, you have other things, services that the building provides, you pay for it. Otherwise, it's not. The Talmud Chacham, he goes and he lends, and he does with grace, even if the person doesn't pay back immediately. He goes to accommodate someone else to get for himself, meticulous in his behavior. Someone else, he'll give you his right arm and left arm. That's why, because again, certain times if you don't do things, what do they claim? You're a bad person. And if he's Talmud Chacham, if he's a Torah scholar, they'll say he's a bad man. The man only pads his own pocket. He's not willing to help someone else. But if that could be said, although it's baseless, but if the behavior could actually engender that kind of comment, you try to avoid it. Okay? This is very important. One should not infringe on somebody else's livelihood. A person is the plumber in the town, and the town really doesn't need more than one plumber, and he's adequate. His work is adequate. It's not A+, but it's adequate. And by you offering your service, you're actually going to take his customers away from him. He wouldn't dare, a Talmud Chacham would not dare do that. There's not even a basis to justify that kind of behavior. It's called infringement. It's considered unfair competition, even though in legal terms it's fair. You know, it's a free, open market. Let the best man win. That's not the way a Talmud Chacham is supposed to behave. Okay. The Gemara tells us, Talmud tells us that if you go and undermine someone else's livelihood, it's ilu natal deshmoso. It's like you took a soul. You hear this? Now, what is a person's sense of self? He's a self-earner. He supports his family, and he's respected. He's a responsible human being. If you undermine his livelihood, and that infringement causes him not to be able to underwrite himself, what are you doing? It's not only your behavior is unfair. Where do you have a right? But what's the end result of that? It's like you took his soul. You take his dignity, you've taken his soul. That's what you've done. Your dignity is, I'm a self-earner. I don't take charity. By you putting my livelihood in jeopardy, where have you put me? Why can't the man sleep at night? He never dreamt he would ever take charity. And yet he's in the position he may have to take charity. So if you, at this point, he doesn't have to take charity. And you, by your infringement on his livelihood, he may, what if you put him in a very embarrassing situation? Therefore, it's like you took his soul. Lo yetzel odom l'olam b'chayev. Person should never bring any pain on anyone throughout his lifetime. We're not talking about physical pain necessarily, financial pain, but even a snide remark. You make a remark, and but that remark may make the person feel not great. I'll give you an example. The Gemara says that a person is b'chan Hashem chaveiro. You alter his name, and the name that you've altered, which is what we call the nickname, is something which is slightly pejorative. I'll give you an example. I remember when I was in elementary school on Lower East Side, this is in the 50s. So once a year, they would actually have to fill out the record, a record on each student. And figuring the record, they would have to record two things. Besides grades, they would have to record your height and your weight. So they would put a scale in front of the classroom, and each child would have to walk up and be weighed. I know myself, when I was a little boy, till up a certain age, I was slightly overweight. I was heavy. And, you know, all my clothing were husky. You know, I didn't have to read about, you know, the Canadian Mountain Police, about the Huskies. I was the Husky. Went to Orchard Street, my mother would buy a pair of pants, Husky. Went to buy a suit, Husky. I'm only 7 years old, but I'm wearing Husky. So, and I remember when they would weigh you, all the kids would look at the scale when you're being weighed. It was embarrassing. I was embarrassed. So if you're that type of person and they call you a chubby, and it wasn't uncommon. In those years, they would call a person chubby, or they would call the person a Sonny boy. And people assume names because they were called Sonny. They called him Sonny, although there was a person, what was it? Sonny Liston. Or was he a fighter? I'm not sure what he was. Sonny. It's not an honorable thing. A person may get used to it. If you called it long enough, you get used to it. But initially, to be called that, it's a little bit of it's denigrating. It's not the most respectful comment. And it says a person who does that, he puts his share in the world to come in jeopardy. Because why? Because you're compromising that person. You're compromising his whole sense of self. Here all of a sudden he's become a sunny, nameless person. Doesn't have a name. Person has a name. I remember in those years in elementary school, a child that was in elementary school, an adult was called Mr. What was a child called? Master. Can you imagine? Master, kid's 5 years old. Master, whatever the name is. For some reason. But there's a certain dignity to it. You're not Jack and Jim and Joe. Master, whatever it is. There is an introduction to that name. It's a person that wipes it out. When we grew up many years ago, if you would speak to an adult, you would never call the adult by his first name, unless maybe he's the Shushan boy. Shushan boy, 65 years old, he's still a Shushan boy, right? Or he's a paper boy. Or he used to deliver the seltzer. We used to carry a case of seltzer on the shoulder where they had the spray bottles up 6 flights of steps. It used to be this way. Maybe him, you didn't call him by you would call him by his first name. But a regular person, your parents, friends, out of respect, there was a respect. Persons of certain age, he deserves the respect. He's not your friend. He's not your buddy. Although if he would say, please call me by my first name, something else. So the Talmud Chacham would always what? Would always give that person that value. I'll give you an example. My mashgiach, he was a mashgiach in Europe. No, he wasn't mashgiach in Europe. He was very special. As a single person, he was the shliach tzibur on the Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur in the mirror in Europe. And he wasn't even married yet. So you can imagine representing hundreds of married and single people on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur to go to the Omid, to be the, I'm not using the word cantor, to be the representative of the community. And in Europe, it was a tremendous Talmud Chacham. And he was a man who had tremendous wisdom, sage wisdom, even before he was an older person. And when I went to yeshiva, they had 180 students in the yeshiva. Today, the numbers are multiples of that. You have yeshivas today, 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 students. Thank God. But in those years, a large yeshiva was 180 students. In Europe, it wasn't uncommon when you referred to people, you'd always refer them by the last name. Like if Larry would have been in my time, my Rosh would say, hey, Diamond, Schwartz, because in Europe, that's what they used to refer to one another. There was no, they didn't call by their first names, or they would refer to them by the name of the city which they came from. That's how people were identified. But there was never the first name. My mashgiach was European, but he was a mashgiach, and he was a person who took every nuance of a person's feelings into account. Never ever called a student not by his first name. He knew the first name of every single student, and he made sure always the student was always called by his first name to give him that sense of this feeling. This relationship has feeling to it. It's not just a sterile relationship. Again, it's a sensitivity. But if you don't have that sensitivity, you do it the way you speak to a stranger by his last name. You speak to the person who's much more than a stranger, much closer, in same manner. You should never cause a person any type of anguish or pain in his lifetime. Kol shel davar. What's the rule of thumb? How do we behave? What should our sensitivities be? It's better be the pursued rather than the pursuer. Better you should be a victim of being embarrassed and embarrassing others. For Odom she'ose kol ha'masim ha'eleh uchyotz ben, and a person behaves in this manner with the utmost level of consideration for another person, even if somebody embarrasses you, you don't immediately react and respond back to him, embarrass him. You don't behave this way because it's not going to correct anything. Allah Omer, the Torah refers to this person as the Omer Li Avdiato. Hashem says, "You are my servant. You are my subject. Yisrael Asher B'cho Espoir. Israel, with you I will be glorified." When God sees the Jew behaving properly, above reproach, and willing to look away and bend over backwards for the sake of someone else, God says, "You are the people who I created this world for you. I'm glorified through you." Person goes to court, Jewish court, and somebody has a claim against him, and it entails a tremendous amount of money if he's found guilty. He goes before the court, and the court rules, the Bezdin rules, he has to pay. And they write up the background on the case, why he's financially obligated, and he's very upset. Very upset because he feels that despite whatever the other person claimed, it was baseless, and he shouldn't have had to pay that kind of money. So what does he do? He takes this document, which has all background information on the record on the basis for the decision, and he runs to a friend of his. He says, "You got to read this, and you'll understand why I was victimized, I was duped, and I was hurt, unjustifiably hurt." So he shows it to his friend, and he looks at it, he starts reading, he starts shaking, and says, "I think you got a case. These judges, they're not fit to sit on a bezdin, on a court. Because if it would have been people like ourselves, there's no way we would have issued this kind of verdict. To me, it seems that you're innocent, based on what I read here." So the Chofetz Chaim writes, firstly, you realize you're going to be the most intelligent person in the world, but unless you're adept and proficient in law, what you think is right may not be right. May not be right. And as a result of that, the verdict was justified. That's firstly. But first and foremost, he says, if you have a claim, rather than saying to the person, you're right, these judges know what they're doing, you're a victim, he should say, something? If you have a claim, let's go to the Bezdin with your claim, and they'll clarify it. And if they can't, they'll retract the verdict, and you won't have to pay. Instead of going right away and giving right and supporting his claim that he was victimized, if you really mean for constructive value, say, so look, let's take the document and let's try to flesh it out here. And let's try to get some level of clarity. And if everything's said and done, then you see they're not qualified, they have a bias, that's a different story. But before you come to that point, you have to do all the pre-work to determine whether there's even a basis for a claim. Secondly, he says, very often when a person presents his case in court, later he thinks to himself, I should have said something else, which I omitted. Or I shouldn't have shared a piece of information. Because of that, it's misunderstood. But very often he only realized certain things afterwards. When he presented his case, the court ruled based on what they heard, the testimony, based on the evidence. After he realized he lost the court, it subconsciously thought, something, I should have presented it differently. Now when he's sharing with his friend what it was all about, it's not accurate. It's slanted. due to his own bias that he should have been more responsible. He was not. So he wants to pin it on the judges, that the judges issued an unjust verdict. That's the Chofetz Chaim writes. And very often it's that way. Did you hear what the rabbi said? It doesn't make any sense. Why does it make any sense? It seems to be too extreme. Why is it too extreme? Just on base what I know, it's too to be too extreme. Because the rabbis I know, they on Shabbos they walk with a cigarette lighter in their pocket. You know, and they have a cigar cutter in their pocket. You know, and they don't criticize us for driving to the temple on the Sabbath. This rabbi's too much for us. This rabbi's too extreme. He's a fanatic. You understand? These people are speaking like they don't know whether it's chocolate or vanilla, but they're experts on flavors. I had a case many years ago, an observant girl, very observant. She was a lawyer, and she came from Toronto. And she dated a boy who was also a lawyer. He was from Queens, and he came from a Bukharan background. Bukharan. And they're both observant. She was already in her upper 20s. He was in his early 30s. Both attractive people, came from very nice families. Thought it'd be great. This would be has great potential. After the date, she calls me. He's too extreme. I said, why is he too extreme? Because he told me on Shabbat, he doesn't use an instant hot. Instant hot, so when you have on the counter this, when you want instantaneous hot water, you press down on that lever or twist that button, and immediately you have scalding hot water coming out, cooked water coming into your cup. He doesn't use it. So he's a fanatic. I said, let me ask you a question. I said, would you consider taking a kettle of unboiled water, put it on the fire on the Shabbat? Would you consider it? He said, of course not. I'm a Shabbos observer. That's called cooking. I said, if you understand the mechanism, the way this instant works, there's a reservoir of water and there's a coil. And when you press down on that lever, that coil turns red hot and that coil boils the water. In essence, it's the same. It's like taking the kettle, put it on the fire. So because you don't understand, you don't realize what's happening, you're depicting him as a fanatic. But it's the exact same thing as you wouldn't put the kettle on the water. So very often people pass judgment based on their lack of understanding and they don't read the script right. And they get right away, they get offended or they get, as they say, hot under the collar. Have you heard of such a thing? A person is a Talmud Chochem, doesn't pass judgment so quickly on anyone. Unless it's been verified, these are the facts and so on and so forth, then we can talk about passing judgment. At least you have all the facts. The court, could they give a verdict before they hear all the information presented in the court? They can't.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
I'm still
I'm
recording.
with you. Okay, we're gonna stop here. We have a class to Parsha 1 o'clock. I had 3 hours sleep last night. I had a bar mitzvah in Lakewood. I didn't get back till about 1:30 and get to bed till about 2:30. It was up at 4.
You did your
4:10.
5:30 class?
I had my 5:30 class this morning.
All right, Rabbi.
Okay.